Hi, and welcome to this week's current news. Today is Wednesday, March 5th, 2025. OPM alters memo after probationary employees, but does not order mass firings reversed. The Theodore Roosevelt Federal Building headquarters of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management is seen on February 3rd, 2025 in Washington, D.C. The Trump administration has revised a January 20th memo asking federal agencies to provide a list of probationary employees to the Office of Personnel Management. Adding a disclaimer on the OPM is not directing agencies to take any specific action. But the memo doesn't call for reinstatement of the tens of thousands of probationary employees who have been fired. Probationary employees are typically in their first or second year of the job. A new paragraph in the revised memo updated Tuesday merely states, "Please note that by this memorandum, OPM is not directing agencies to take any specific performance-based actions regarding probationary employees. Agencies have ultimate decision-making authority over and responsibility for such personnel actions." On Tuesday afternoon, the American Federation of Government Employees, a union representing 800,000 civil servants, called on agencies to act anyway. Every agency should immediately rescind these unlawful terminations and reinstate everyone who was illegally fired, wrote AFG National President Everett Kelly in a statement. Judge had ruled probationary firings likely violated multiple statutes. OPM issued the revised memo in part to provide clarity in light of a recent court order. An agency spokesperson confirmed, referring to last week's rulings from a federal judge in San Francisco. U.S. District Judge William Alsup ruled that OPM had likely violated multiple statutes in ordering agencies to carry out the firings and ordered OPM to rescind the January 20th memo, along with another issued February 14th. That asked agencies to terminate probationary employees by February 17th. No statute anywhere ever has granted OPM the authority to direct the termination of employees in other agencies. Alsup wrote in this memorandum opinion. In court last week, the Trump administration's attorney argued that OPM had merely asked agencies to carry out the firings. Asking is not ordering, Assistant U.S. Attorney Kelsey Helland argued. Alsup was unconvinced, concluding at the end of the hearing that OPM had in fact ordered agencies to fire probationary employees, an act that he said was illegal and should be stopped. The National Science Foundation confirmed Monday that it had reinstated with back pay all 86 probationary employees it had fired, based on updated guidance from OPM and federal courts. OPM inserts new language about how performance is to be measured. Another modification in the January 20th memo seeks to recast how probationary periods should be used. The original January 20th memo reads, probationary periods are an essential tool for agencies to assess employee performance and manage staffing levels. The March 4th revision reads, probationary periods are an essential tool for agencies to assess employee performance and ensure that a probationer's conduct and performance have established that the individual will be an asset to the government. The new language echoes guidance that OPM issued in that same February 14th memo, instructing agencies on how they should measure probationary employees' performance when deciding whether they should be retained. An employee's performance must be viewed through the current needs and best interest of the government. The new language echoes guidance. In light of the President's directive to dramatically reduce the size of the federal workforce, the memo reads, in their lawsuit challenging the firings, the plaintiffs said the guidance has no basis in law, writing, neither OPM or any agency may lawfully terminate a probationary employee based on performance. ALSUP scheduled another hearing in the case on March 13th. Martin Marty, leading scholar of American religion, dies at 97. Martin Marty, one of the foremost interpreters of religion in American public life, died on Tuesday. He was 97 years old. For more than half a century, Marty was on the go-to interview for journalists, trying to make sense of some religious moment, whether it was presidential election or an ecumenical agreement between Catholics and Lutherans. In 1976, he appeared on NPR's All Things Considered to explain what it might mean that born-again Christian Jimmy Carter was entering the White House. The Southern Baptist tradition, at its best, is one that doesn't want merging of church and state, Marty said. And all you ever have to do to someone like Carter is to remind him that he might be tilting that way, and he would back off very fast. A quarter century later, leading up to the inauguration of George W. Bush, Marty appeared on NPR's Weekend Edition to talk about concerns that presidents take their oath of office on a Bible rather than something like the U.S. Constitution. It's terribly offensive, he explained to host Scott Simon. If you create the impression that other believers and non-believers can't be full citizens, More recently, Marty helped listeners understand the fiery tone of Barack Obama's posture during the 2008 presidential campaign. A lot of Jeremiah Wright rhetoric matches that of Martin Luther King Jr., he said. You hear King accusing the nation for an unjust war in Vietnam or for segregating. It's just as harsh. Marty was a writer, teacher, historian, and pastor. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Catherine Albanese was a PhD student studying American religious history under Marty at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He was, even then, already sought after to explain and interpret belief. He was the primary spokesperson for religion in America, she said. He had a way of framing the story in ways that resonated. Marty won a National Book Award for his 1970 volume, Righteous Empire, about the American Protestant tradition. In addition to his teaching and scholarly work, he was an editor and columnist at the magazine The Christian Century, always believing his work wasn't just for academics, but for both clergy and laity in churches. As well as in the general public. In 1997, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal for increasing the public understanding of religion. Albanese said that the same way Marty invited the public into understanding, he invited his students into the conversation. I grew up in an Italian-American neighborhood, she said. I didn't come from any kind of privileged background at all. And he welcomed me in, and he made me feel like I could play ball with his crowd. Albanese went on to become a scholar of American religion herself, and taught for decades at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She served as president of the American Academy of Religion, just a few years after Marty himself held that office. Albanese said, of all things that she learned from her teacher, he taught me to listen to other people and be generous of the other person and feel some sense of their humanity. Marty admired the richness of American religious diversity. Marty was an ordained Lutheran pastor, and for 2 decades co-taught a course with the University of Chicago colleague Clark Gilpin, called The Public Church in America. It was an introductory class for ministry students at the school. Gilpin said Marty always insisted that books by Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King appeared on the syllabus. These were 2 different ways of thinking about people whose mission in life was transformation. For Dorothy Day, an internal change that led to her conversion to Roman Catholicism. In the case of Martin Luther King, if change is going to occur, and it must occur, the change is going to come from margins, Gilpin said. These multiple ways of thinking about religion's role in personal and public life were lessons Marty taught time and time again, including in his groundbreaking study of conservative religious movements. The Fundamentalism Project. It was an undertaking that led him far afield ahead from his mainland Protestant roots, but one that helped many scholars gain a better understanding of the phenomenon. Gilpin remembers, one of the last courses he taught with Marty, called The Bazaar of the American Religion. The class was designed to help students understand how extremely different religious traditions from conservative Lutherans who came to the U.S. in the 19th century to social justice-focused Catholics who emerged after Vatican II, more recently arrived Muslim immigrants forming communities, influence each other in the marketplace of religious practice, and add to the American public life. The point of the class was that difference was not going to result in polarization, said Gilpin. For Marty, it was going to result in a dialogue that led each one of us to a better place. An Algerian scientist splits his gaze between microbes and Mars. Yusuf Salam in his lab with the fossil filaments found in gypsum. In a way, it all started with the road trip about a decade ago. My father, he had the car, so I had to borrow the car from him, says Yusuf Salam, who was interning at the University of Modena e Reggio Emilia in Italy at the time. Yeah, let's go together, his dad said. The father-son duo were headed north to a gypsum quarry near the Mediterranean coast of their home country in Algeria. Salam and his colleagues would go on to find microbial fossils in those minerals, a first for Algerian gypsum. And later, as a PhD student at the University of Bern, he and a team of scientists would show they could use a special instrument to detect the chemical signatures of those microbes, with the idea they might one day use the technique to scan for ancient life among similar minerals on Mars. The results were published in the journal Frontiers in Astronomy and Space Sciences. What this study in Algeria really does is it highlights that you can use chemical methods to infer that biology is in the mineral. Says biochemist Bonnie Baxter, who directs the Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster University and wasn't involved in the research. And chemical methods are just a little more transferable at Mars. The hefty hull containing the tiniest passengers. Salam's dad, a statistician, ignited him in a curiosity about the world. With the Algerian currency, it's quite expensive, he says, but the first science magazine I got, it was from my father. The first biology book, it was from my father, and I was super thirsty to learn all the time. Salam went on to study microbiology and paleontology. He became interested in ancient microbes. And the tiny fossils they leave behind in minerals like gypsum. And then during the internship in Italy in 2016, he was chatting with his supervisor when the stars aligned. He said, "Yeah, we know almost everything about the Mediterranean," he recalls. Selam, but there is a place that we couldn't go, and we would like to get some gypsum. That place happened to be Algeria, which is how Salem wound up driving his father's green Toyota Echo at that quarry. Over a couple days, he used a hammer and a chisel to collect more than 60 pounds of gypsum. "I was the one making the sampling while my dad was just watching," he chuckles. When Selam got the samples to the lab, he saw sinuous filaments preserved in the mineral. They were ancient fossilized microbes, which is an indication that gypsum could preserve life. Says Salam, "Because they are fossils, we cannot be 100% sure about the species. They might have been a kind of algae or bacteria." After that internship and earning 3 master's degrees, Salam got a couple odd jobs. But when COVID hit, he was out of work for years. "I was going through a hard time because I couldn't prove to my father that I was doing something interesting," says Salam. "So it was kind of disappointing." But Salam applied to universities and for scholarships, and at last, he got into the PhD program in physics at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and that really impressed his dad. He was like, "Okay, now we are talking," recalls Salam. Keep going. In graduate school, he worked on an idea to help fill into the fossil record of life on Earth by looking at Mars. That's because it's only possible to look back at microbial life on Earth so far. Plate tectonics, and volcanic activity on our planet when it was just a baby erased the clues of its early existence. So basically, we lost the first billion years regarding the history of the Earth. Says Salam, "We have a gap. That gap includes any really ancient microbes that might have otherwise been fossilized. Luckily, though, there's Mars. Mars is a screenshot of the early Earth, looking like 4 billion years ago. Of course, not exactly quite similar. By studying Mars, scientists might learn about the ancient Earth. And if it's a big if, Mars has microbes fossilized in its gypsum. Researchers will need the right tools to load onto rovers to look for that life." Salam's PhD focused on testing whether a small but powerful instrument called laser ablation ionization mass spectrometer could detect the chemical traces of those microbes. "It's basically a laser beam hitting the sample," explains Salem. "And this laser will vaporize part of the material, creating some atoms. you will have a spectra of the different elements that are existing in the rock. Look at those spectra, can determine whether there are fossilized life in the rock. But before that laser could be sent to Mars, it had to be tested on Earth. And Salam had the perfect sample, his Algerian gypsum. It worked beautifully. We proved that our instrument is capable to detect signatures of life in the gypsum. Says Salam, suggesting that one night it might help do the same on Mars. Baxter says the study highlights the special relationship between minerals and microbes. It seems that this kind of intimate interconnection has been present for billions of years on our planet and potentially elsewhere. She says, I think it's a beautiful signature of how our biosphere and on Earth are working together to create what we see on this planet. Still, Baxter believes the laser approach on Mars might be tricky because it would have to detect fossils that are billions instead of millions of years old. So I think that's a big caveat, she says. And she's curious to know more about the biology of the microbes fossiled in the Algerian gypsum. As for Salam, he's proud that his first ever scientific publication highlights his home country. But just before he finished up in September, his father passed away. But he says, in reality, he's always standing with me. Maybe he will say, don't stop here, keep going. The Trump administration layoffs hit NOAA, agency that forecasts weather and hurricanes. A hurricane specialist looks at a satellite image of Hurricane Beryl, the first hurricane of the 2024 season. The National Hurricane Center provides forecasts of major storms, many of which make landfall in the U.S. The center part of NOAA, the country's oceans and atmosphere-focused agency. Experts say ongoing staff cuts at the agency could endanger some of its core missions, like forecasting the weather. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration began firing staff on Thursday. Continuing a wave of government-wide layoffs. Ordered by the Trump administration. The terminations, which include staff at the National Weather Service, could impact weather forecasting. Used by many people and industries across the U.S. economy. It wasn't immediately clear how many people were fired from NOAA. Neither the agency nor the Department of Commerce, which oversees NOAA, responded to the messages seeking comments. NPR has confirmed the firings at NOAA through multiple sources who asked for anonymity for fear of retribution. Some fired employees were given less than 2 hours to leave the office. According to a source with direct knowledge who asked to remain anonymous for fear of reprisal, they said staff that manages NOAA's central weather forecasting models scrambled in that time frame to transfer access to employees who remain at NOAA. The agency joins many others across the federal government to have their workforce cut in recent days. The move is part of the Trump administration's efforts to reduce the size of the federal government. Thousands of scientists, doctors, administrative employees, grant managers, and more have been affected in the mass firings. NPR has seen several copies of a termination letter for NOAA employees, all of whom were in a probationary period with the agency. The status is applied because they have either joined NOAA recently or have been promoted. The letters informed the employees that they were not fit for continued employment because your ability, knowledge, and/or skills do not fit the agency's current needs. Impact of cuts to NOAA staff. The impacts of the cuts at NOAA, say experts and agency employees who spoke to the condition of anonymity out of fear of reprisal by the Trump administration, could be profound. The agency has around 12,000 employees that work on a broad range of topics, from conditions in the upper atmosphere to fish in the depths of the ocean. NOAA monitors and forecasts as does the weather report many Americans read on their phones. Disruptions in NOAA's employee base could, among other outcomes, result in less accurate weather forecasts. Experts warn or delays in updating maritime maps, key to safe passage within the U.S. oceanic waters. Breaking up, defunding, or reducing NOAA's highly integrated workforce will severely impact our nation's economy. 5 of NOAA's former administrators said in an open letter to Congress and the American public. It will also make it more difficult to receive weather forecasts, be assured of the safety of seafood, and ensure the timely delivery of purchases from overseas, which are delivered primarily through our nation's ports. Timothy Gallaudet, a former Navy officer and oceanographer who served as an acting administrator of NOAA during the first Trump administration, warned that weakening NOAA could have national security and economic impacts that are really seemingly contradicting the administration's priorities now. The risks include disruptions to weather operations, marine shipping safety, and military activities. The NOAA also houses and supports cutting-edge climate science research. NPR reported previously that several of Trump's January executive orders focused on cutting or slashing climate programs specifically. NOAA officials received a list of terms related to those executive orders and were instructed to review related grants and programs for potential cuts. "We all earned our positions," says one former employee who worked in fisheries policy within the National Marine Fisheries Service, one of NOAA's offices. They asked to speak anonymously out of fear of retribution from the Trump administration. "It's so disheartening, and it's really reducing the intellectual and regulatory capabilities of the agency." Another NOAA employee, who asked not to be named because of concerns about jeopardizing future employment opportunities, fretted that the move could stunt the agency's work for years to come. "It's an absolute gutting of young talent," they say. How could this affect NOAA operations? NOAA's most widely known offices include the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center. NWS produces weather forecasts which are used daily by millions of Americans. As well as a vast number of industries, including shipping and aviation. Those weather models need active care and monitoring by scientists. Even a small reduction in the amount or quality of data coming in for the weather models can impact weather prediction accuracy. NOAA scientists also monitor global climate patterns. That have major impacts on the U.S., like the seasonal El Niño and La Niña, which can determine whether parts of the country see droughts or floods. The agency's long-running rainfall records are used by engineers around the country, who are required to design roads, bridges, and other infrastructure to withstand flooding. The agency also operates the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, which manages a fleet of scientific and survey ships, along with highly specialized research airplanes. Those ships and planes provide key data for climate, weather, fisheries, underwater mapping, and more. An employee at NOAA, who asked not to be named for fear of retribution, said such cuts would have a direct impact on the capabilities of the office to carry out its crucial coastal mapping duties. Those include planned upcoming projects like creating new ocean floor maps in the Arctic, where climate change is causing sea ice to retreat, and opening up new areas for global maritime travel that are poorly charted. The U.S. currently boasts some of the most sustainable oceanic fisheries in the world, says Janet Coit. Who led NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Services, or NOAA Fisheries. Under the Biden administration, the office's ability to refine the management could suffer, she says. Cuts, Coit says, could hollow the ability of NOAA Fisheries. It raises the question, she says. How do you support the growth of our seafood sector while simultaneously eviscerating the agency that's responsible for sustainable management and many other aspects of supporting our seafood sector? It will take years to understand the full scope of the impacts of such staff cuts, says Rick Spinard, NOAA's administrator during the Biden administration. NOAA is currently one of the premier science agencies in the world. He says, and historically, leaders have been able to pick and choose the best and the brightest. But if you lose the intellectual capital, it's going to take decades to get that back, Spinard says.